Hello, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for being here this morning, and thanks to the San Antonio Book Festival and Nowhere Bookshop for making this event possible. I'm Siri Carpenter, and I'm a science journalist and editor based in Madison, Wisconsin, and I'm co-founder and editor-in-chief of The Open Notebook, a nonprofit publication whose mission is to help science writers improve their skills. I'm also the editor of the book, The Craft of Science Writing, which was published last year. It is such a pleasure and an honor to introduce Alex Riley, who I'll be speaking with today. Alex is an award-winning science writer whose first book, A Cure for Darkness, The Story of Depression and How We Treat It, hits the shelves this week. Alex received a Best Feature Award from the Association of British Science Writers for his reporting on the Friendship Bench, a project that began in Zimbabwe in 2006 and has since provided mental health care to thousands of people in New York. A former research scientist, Alex has co-authored peer-reviewed scientific papers while working at the Natural History Museum in London. Since leaving academia in 2015, he began writing popular science articles for magazines such as New Scientist, PBS's Nova Next, BBC Future, Mosaic Science, Aeon, and Nautilus magazine. He lives in Bristol in the UK. Please consider purchasing Alex's book from Nowhere Bookshop, the book festival's bookseller. Here's the book on sale this week and to you right now. As you all know, independent bookstores have had a hard time during the pandemic, so we hope you'll support them and Alex and the other festival writers by purchasing their excellent books. Just click on the site. Finally, before we get started, I just want to let everyone know that you can feel free to place questions for Alex in the Q&A box at any point, and I'll turn to these toward the end of our conversation. And with that, let's get the conversation started. Alex, it's so great to be here with you today and to celebrate your fantastic book with you. We've worked together in the past, starting when you wrote a piece for the Open Notebook a few years ago about managing a mental illness and a career in science writing. What made you decide to write a book about the history of depression and its treatment?
Well, yeah, it's great to be here in San Antonio. Looks a lot like my living room. It's actually just started raining outside, so that's yeah, not like in San Antonio right now, I'm guessing. So yeah, after I wrote that article for you in the Open Notebook, which is about being a writer and managing mental illness, I was really struggling to find treatments that worked for me. I was on quite a high dose of antidepressants. I'd been through CBT. I'd self-medicated with some drugs and found that they didn't really shift the depression for that long. And it was a recurrent depression, so it kept coming back and getting more severe. And so I think after writing the article for you, I just wanted to kind of understand it myself and reach out and hopefully find something that was either evidence-based, that wasn't being prescribed by doctors, or something that was on the horizon that I could look forward to. So it was really, it started off with, it wasn't really a book idea. I just sort of started researching myself, and that started pretty much as soon as I'd written that article, for the Open Notebook. And then it just got deeper and deeper. I got an agent, and she really helped me try and get a theme together. So depression's such a broad topic. We didn't know really how to pitch this idea of, yes, I'm really struggling with depression. And we just thought, well, maybe just you're searching for a new treatment, you're searching for something that works, and maybe that's the theme, is to research the treatments that are available and also the ones that are from the past. Like, where do I sit in the history of the treatment of depression? And at the time, there were some other books being published that were quite critical of antidepressants. Obviously, psychotherapy has a lot of stigma attached to it. People don't want to talk about going to see a therapist. And then there are other treatments that I went into this book not really understanding, and I wanted to understand them, whether it was ECT or deep brain stimulation, psychedelics. And yeah, it was curiosity driven. And personally, it was, I hope there's something else because this isn't working right now. And
Right.
so that was end of 2017.
Yeah, like a lot of great books, it seems like it's one that was driven by a curiosity where you felt like I am the ideal audience for this book. I want to ask you about something that might seem like a fairly basic question, but it's one that seems to have been surprisingly difficult to answer, and that's the question of what is depression? One thread that evolving understanding that depression is not just one thing, that it comes in many varieties. And so I'm wondering what you think about how that understanding has contributed to efforts to treat depression, both over time and in different circumstances and different cultural contexts.
Yes, I think right now, looking back through history, like you said, there have been numerous varieties of depression, diagnoses, states. I think during the 19th century, I came across so many different types of depression that, and this didn't make it into the book because it just got a bit, it was a lot of psychiatrists and philosophers were kind of writing stuff like the type of depression where you have a delusion that you're a horse. And that was a standalone, I mean, it should have made into the book, to be honest, now I'm saying it. But there were so many different varieties. And then with Emile Kriplin, he then, the 19th century psychiatrist that I kind of follow along with Sigmund Freud, he kind of put them into this sort of big bag of manic depressive insanity. I think we're in a similar position now with major depressive disorder, which is what the diagnosis for the DSM and also for the ICD, the two classification systems for mental illnesses. But I think we need to take some hints from the past. I think they're really helpful, that we have different types of depression. For example, some people might be overeating, they might be oversleeping, they might be having severe anxiety or phobias, and that used to be called atypical depression. We seem to have forgotten this sort of diversity. We kind of just bundle everyone into the same major depressive disorder or just the word depression. But two people can have the opposing symptoms. Like I said, if someone's overeating, the classical depression is actually they're not eating, they're not sleeping, and they don't have any anxiety because they just feel numb. So I really hope that we can remember the history of the different sort of varieties of depression. I don't think they're a reflection of the reality of depression. I think they're just guides that can help us pick apart different people and say, okay, well, this has been shown to work more in this range of symptoms, whether it's antidepressants or whether it's more holistic stuff like exercise or diet or reducing inflammation. Like, these are things that are now coming back into the conversation, which are really, and that, I say coming back into conversation, all of exercise, diet, and all of these holistic approaches have been mentioned as far back as, ancient Greece and ancient India, such as Ayurvedic medicine. It's not really rocket science. It's I think psychiatry lost its way with focusing on just medication and psychotherapy. So yeah, your question was, what is depression? It's a lot of things, and I think we can start to pick apart the different varieties that might come along with the symptoms that people present. And I think, yeah, we can then guide people's treatment more accurately. And the knowledge is already there, so there's nothing we just need to kind of pay attention to what people are telling us. Because when I first got diagnosed, it was basically a 10-minute conversation with my general practitioner that ended with a citalopram prescription. So he didn't ask, any of these things that I've discussed of, what was my sleep like, what was my anxiety levels. It was simply just, I just thought, and my girlfriend at the time said that I was depressed. And he just took that and ran with it and said, okay, well, he's depressed, let's give him an antidepressant.
Right. Well, let's dive a little bit into that history. We could go back many centuries. I want to go though to the place where you began in the book, really, and that is with this. There's no figure in all of psychiatry, I think, who's more recognizable than Sigmund Freud. And yet, in the popular imagination, Freud is really a caricature, a cigar and a chaise longue and an obsession with hidden sexual desires. But you reveal Freud in such a more textured way in the book. And it's one of the things that I love about the book is that he's a real multifaceted, fascinating, and tragic human being. Um, and you go from his early studies in anatomy to his own long struggle with depression and his attempts to self-medicate with cocaine, how his understanding of depression evolved over his years. Can you talk about how Freud's experiences and ideas have contributed to a modern understanding of depression and are still relevant today?
Well, he was when he was a young man, he was really ahead of his time when he was self-medicating, like you say, with cocaine, and he drank the cocaine solutions. I've read a few books that mentioned that he uses other approaches, but he was very much, I'm just going to have a little tonic of cocaine. And at the time, that was completely normal. It was a drug that was seen as a medicine and not the narcotic that we know it to be now. So, and he never really lost sight of that chemistry, the power of chemistry. So today, as we look for new drugs, whether it's in psychedelics or whether it's making antidepressants we know about more effective, or using ketamine, which is now being proved, I think both in the US and in Europe now. Definitely in the US, the FDA approved it in 2019. So yeah, he had the first 20 years of his career, he was an anatomist, he was a neuroscientist, he was well respected, and he was using a drug for his depression and just wanted that drug to be a part of the psychiatric arsenal. So even though we don't really link antidepressants to Freud, because after he was 40 years old, he started his own theory of where mental illness and neuroses come from. He was it was one of the first to really kind of test sort of what was it called? It was, because we call it psychopharmacology today, but back then it was called pharmacopsychology. And Emile Kriplin was doing the same thing in Germany, just over the border from Freud in Vienna. So yeah, what does he? I think Freud is indirectly related to the theories of depression when it comes to psychology, because many of his successors have been more important. So I kind of cover the life and work of Carl Abraham, and he really tied depression to a sense of being unable to love, being unable to have that connection with people. He attributed it to the wicked mother theory, which is similar to what we've had in autism and schizophrenia, where you have, you blame the mum for everything, and that's, obviously not the way it is. But his idea is that it's more of a psychological thing and more of okay, I'm unable to love the world, therefore I hate it. I think has some relevance. I don't think it's as important as Freud's push to take the causes of mental illness back into childhood. I think that's his main contribution to psychology, is to think of childhood trauma. I mean, he was very much fixated on sexual abuse, and that's only one facet of childhood disadvantage. So, and then we get into more of the social psychology and the work of John Bowlby and Melanie Klein. And I think that's Freud's really true. I guess that's how he's influenced psychology, is through the work of others. All of those people wouldn't have been working in psychoanalysis. I think I kind of gained a real I don't know. I came into it quite hesitant about psychoanalysis, the project in 2017, and I came to really respect it as a field. I mean, he was wrong about a lot of things, was right, but I think the general idea of talking therapy and focusing on childhood trauma is really something we depend upon every day with treatment of not just depression, but every mental illness has that. I think that a recent study showed that 3/4 of mental illnesses start in childhood. So 75% is the majority of them start before the age of 18.
Right.
That's frightening, but also allows the possibility of prevention.
Yeah. You mentioned Emile Kriplin a couple of times, and I want to talk about him because I found him to be such a fascinating and haunted figure in your book, and I hadn't known too much about him. But in many ways, Freud and Kraepelin represent too often, seemingly opposing understandings of depression. One centered on interior life and how experience shapes the mind, and the other on biological explanations for depression and anxiety. Can you talk about how Freud and Kraepelin ended up seeing depression and its treatment through these different lenses, and how those frameworks for thinking about depression in terms of psychology versus biology have sort of circled closer and closer to one another over time?
Yeah, so it's easy to separate the history of psychiatry into those two fields, and it was often done, but it was mainly done after they had, so Emile Kriplin and Sigmund Freud had finished their work. At the time, they both used, so Emile Kriplin used counseling, which would be a form of psychotherapy. Like I said, Sigmund Freud was really interested in the effects of cocaine, and one of his last written pieces, I think in 1938, and he died in 1939, he kind of wrote about, he mentioned the power of a chemical substance would provide undreamt of possibilities in therapy. So he's still thinking about it just before he dies. He hasn't lost that sight. He's just
sort of
more
saying,
well
okay,
known
maybe
to
it's
be.
not cocaine, but
Yeah, forget about the cocaine that I took for 10 years, but it might be something else. And he was right. I mean, 10 years later, the first antidepressants were discovered, and then everyone wanted to forget about psychoanalysis. So it's been a history where we have tried to separate the two fields. And Emile Kriplin, he's kind of like called the father of biological psychiatry or scientific psychiatry, because he set up a world's leading institution in Munich that had all of the sort of anatomy instruments. He created this huge hub for science. He had Alois Alzheimer, who in 1907 is now famous for discovering Alzheimer's. Well, he'd called it just a peculiar dementia. Then Kriplin, in his textbook, he then named it Alzheimer's disease. So yeah, Kriplin is pinned as this biological psychiatrist because he had this institution that was focused on microscopes and chemical analyses of blood samples. But as similar to Freud, actually, when they were both students or young men trying to make their way in science, he tried the anatomy sort of side of things, of trying to find the bit of the brain that was going wrong, or they were trying to find some sort of indication of where does schizophrenia, or what was called dementia precox back then, where does depressive insanity come from? And they were really sort of trying to find that nexus in the brain. And Kraepelin was really ahead of his time by saying the instruments we have are never going to discover this. Like, he just, even as a student, he said he just put his hands up essentially and was just like, this isn't going to work. And what I'm going to do is actually try and classify the mental disorders first, and then we can try and find some biological basis for the different ones that I try and figure out. And that's when he went off and started studying thousands of symptom cards that he created for his patients and putting them into groups, which I imagine him like making a massive jigsaw piece a jigsaw puzzle. But he then, before he died, he then said, "I actually don't think I got it right."
Mm-hmm.
So, but he is
Yeah.
famous for most of all. He is famous for separating mood disorders from psychotic disorders, which lasted for a long time, and right now has been it's not really seen as a viable way of understanding mental
Mm-hmm.
illness, because bipolar and schizophrenia are seen as far more closely related than bipolar is to other mood disorders such as major
Mm-hmm.
depression or
Mm-hmm.
so I forgot what your question was. Have I answered that?
You have, yes.
But
Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking about Kraepelin, I mean, one, reading the book, I felt like, gosh, he's someone I really think I would have liked to know. He was fascinating. I also think that if he were alive today, he would have drawn a lot of value out of the use of spreadsheets. He seems like someone who
yeah,
really, his mind worked in this very methodical kind of way, and a really fascinating character. I want to talk a little bit, and you kind of provided a nice segue into this, and thinking about where in the brain is this nexus. In the popular understanding of psychiatric treatments of bygone times, there are two schools of treatment: lobotomy and electroconvulsive therapy, that I think tend to elicit some combination of horror and revulsion in people. And you examined the history of both of these types of treatment at length. And what did you learn?
so lobotomy is as horrendous as it is, as a lot of people will think. It is a, cutting into someone's skull and slicing part of their brain,
Yeah, it's
but
not good.
it's not good. But at the same time, if you kind of put yourself, and this is what I hope to do with the book, is to kind of provide a viewpoint not from today but from the actual time in the 1930s, and there weren't any treatments. People were dying from starvation, from really severe depressions. People were in institutions and delusional. They were um, suicidal. They would they would try and kill themselves day after day if they could. And so these are some of the sickest people that you would likely meet. And lobotomy, so the prefrontal lobotomy, although it is a drastic and horrendous treatment, it could be used to calm these suicidal patients, and that's what it wasn't seen as a cure by a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
The most famous, Walter Freeman, the guy who became the most famous person for developing the treatment in the US. He, from his first writings, he kind of acknowledged that you lose some personality, you lose some spark of the individual with this treatment. So it should really only be used in hopeless cases. I think,
Mm-hmm.
I still think, and some patients were really glowing about their reviews after they had it. They were like, "I can go to the cinema and I can, not be compounded by anxiety and obsessive compulsions and these things that, if the operation didn't kill them, because it killed between 2 and 20% of people, which is a horrendous
Mm-hmm.
rate of death, they could live a life that maybe might not be ideal, but they can live a life outside of the mental institution. And yes, I kind of found that although horrendous, you can see why it was used in a time when there weren't any other options. And then Walter Freeman kind of became more radicalized in his treatment and started using
Mm-hmm.
transorbital lobotomies, which everyone was saying that this is not a treatment that we want to condone. His colleague James Watts, the neurosurgeon who did the surgeries, he then separated himself entirely from Freeman.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's pretty gory. Transorbital lobotomy is going through the back of the eye socket and cutting part of the
Mm-hmm.
brain. So it's rightly not allowed. Yeah, it was. I think it was banned in the 1960s, and it was first of all in the Soviet Union, and then I think the US followed shortly afterwards. And electroshock therapy, again, was really horrendous in terms of, it would give this massive grand mal convulsion. It would break, it would be, break bones. You'd get fractures around the sockets of your legs or your arms or your jaw because you clamped down so tightly. And the people administering it, the psychiatrists or neurologists, didn't really know who it was effective for. So you would, I think in the 1940s, it was given to pretty much anyone. And only now do we know that it's most effective for psychotic depressions that haven't responded to other treatments. And also, unlike lobotomy, it's actually become a modern treatment with safeguards and anesthesia, muscle relaxants, so there's no chance of any sort of damage. And I've been to, for my research, I went to Italy to kind of look at the original machines in Rome, and I've talked to people there, the curators who have the original machine that Cioletti and Bini, the two people who developed this treatment, that they used. And then I've also been to New York and Copenhagen. So Copenhagen is one of the, Denmark is one of the leaders in electroconvulsive therapy, both in research and also in its use as a therapy. And yeah, they couldn't be too. They're so different in how the modern form is from the old one. I don't think there's any such similar transformation in psychiatry. All that said, I think we should always remember that it isn't a perfect treatment, and it has quite severe side effects with memory loss, and it is also used without modification, without anesthesia, in countries that might not have the resources to have those sort of expensive drugs. So it's still a controversial topic, and I think quite rightly so. But in terms of its efficacy with psychotic depressions, it's unbeaten. So yeah, I hope that makes sense, and I hope I've explained both of those things. Lobotomies, that was probably the hardest, along with the eugenics sort of chapter. I think lobotomy was probably the hardest to write in terms of trying to kind of see why this happened and seeing some really damaged people from essentially this hope for a treatment.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to talking about some more contemporary areas of research and treatment. First, just a reminder to everyone that you can put your questions in the Q&A box at any time. But yeah, I'd like to talk about some areas of research and depression treatment that you talk about in the book, such as deep brain stimulation, psychedelics, treatments that target inflammation processes. Why did you decide to home in on these fields of modern research?
Because they were the most in the news at the time, I think. So DBS is in the news because it's quite controversial. It's kind of a successor of lobotomies in a way, because it is brain surgery, but you're not taking anything out of the brain, and it's a tiny electrode that's fed into a part of the brain that's been tied to depression. This really overactive area 25, Brodmann's area 25, that Helen Mayberg's work has shown. If you put a tiny electrode next to it and have that buzz, it kind of shuts that off. And it's one of the most remarkable treatments because it works instantly when it works. So you've got none of this 3 weeks waiting time for antidepressants, or therapy can take years. Whereas people who have failed every single treatment and still feel depressed or suicidal, and I've watched the change, not in the room, but from videos that Helen sent me, and their whole like how they hold themselves and how they discuss it is like a switch. It's remarkable. And so I think deep brain stimulation, it also revealed how depression. So going back to your first question about the diversity of depression, it also revealed how severe it can be. and how the most hopeless cases of people who have tried everything, so antidepressants, ECT, psychotherapy, ketamine, psychedelics, have tried everything and nothing's worked, and they still feel this burden, and they feel suicidal. And then for this to work for them is really it's still an experimental treatment. It's still not given to people as a prescription, but it's one of the things that it really revealed to me is that there are things on the horizon for everyone, whether you have quite, I don't want to say mild depression because I don't think there's such a thing, but that's what it is called, to really, really severe psychotic depressions. There is something on the horizon, and that then leads me to inflammation. So inflammation kind of wraps up with the diet and exercise that I've discussed, which I think is really powerful because everyone pretty much can change those things if you have, some money for new diet, or you can spend some more time exercising. I mean, if you're depressed, you're not going to want to do either of those things, so you'll have to wait until it's more of a preventative than a treatment. In my own case, obviously I can't exercise if I'm suffering from a depression, but when I have lucid periods like now, I exercise, I try and eat well, and that kind of circles around the whole discussion of inflammation. And there's a lot of hype around inflammation. There's a book published, I don't know if it was big in the US, The Inflamed Mind, in 2017. And it kind of said the radical new approach to depression. And one of the people I spoke to is actually an old approach to depression that had first arose in the 1980s, but no one listened to it because everyone was focused on serotonin, people were focused on SSRIs. And there was this 3 groups, one in the US, one in the Netherlands, and one in Ireland. And I met the guy who was the leader of the Irish group, who were finding some really interesting things in depressed patients in their blood. They had the same signs as you would have from Crohn's disease or these autoimmune diseases. They had very low grade inflammation, and they wondered, well, if that's related to their depression, could we then use anti-inflammatories? And the answer was actually probably not, because anti-inflammatories come with a lot of side effects. But then that led to the question of diet, because that's known to reduce inflammation, healthy diet, and exercise. And yeah, it's still a field in its infancy. The studies aren't, I mean, there are some really interesting longitudinal studies that show children with high inflammation you can predict not which ones, but the more likely to develop mental illness by the time they turn 18 or 21. And there are thousands of individuals in that study. And psychedelics, again, it was all over the news. I reached out for it. I harvested, some magic mushrooms when I was nothing seemed to work for me, and that didn't work for me. But I knew that it had potential, and it's not because of the studies, but also just the history of it. The history of these psychoactive drugs, it goes back millennia, like from Siberia to South America to Central America into Africa. Like these drugs have been part of our history for so much longer than science has been around. So I was really interested, and this is why I focused on researchers in Brazil, is because they were more in touch with this indigenous history. Like they didn't just see science as, psychedelics work. They actually thought, well, yeah, we kind of knew that from all the people who've been using them for centuries. What we're doing now is translating that knowledge into something that is scientific and hopefully medicinal. So, and I wanted to write more than just on those 3 broad topics, but I had to limit myself because I couldn't spend that much time on new treatments. But those are the 3 that I think deserved attention. I could be wrong. I'm sure there are many more treatments that could be discussed, and that's really hopeful.
Well, I think those discussions really helped cement this idea that that historically it feels like there's been this push to think of there being one true treatment for depression or one true way of thinking of depression. And I think what you show in the book is that there's this really multifaceted way of thinking about how to treat depression, that different things are going to be best for different people at different times. There's a lot that we don't know yet. So I really appreciated, even given the big question marks at the end of all of those discussions, it created this kind of more nuanced sense of how we should be thinking about it. I don't know if I've had a conversation in the last year that has gone this long without talking about COVID, but it does feel like no conversation about mental health is complete these days without some conversation about COVID. And one of the many tragedies associated with the pandemic, of course, is the toll that it has taken on people's mental health. And obviously some of the particular stressors of the pandemic will at some point ease, hopefully soon. And we can hope at least that likewise some significant portion of the mental health burden that it has placed on people will also let up. But from what you've learned by looking at depression through an historical lens, what do you think is important for people and societies to be thinking about when it comes to treating depression in the wake of this global trauma?
Well, like I mentioned in the book, it's quite frightening that the effects of a pandemic almost overlap with the risk factors for depression and other mental illnesses with frightening acuity. So unemployment, isolation, death of loved ones, financial uncertainty around the future. So I think what I hope happens is we focus on those risk factors in terms of not allowing people to actually, because once you first start suffering or living with a mental disorder, then that's more likely to continue. So I think prevention would be what I would hope for in any case. So that would be reducing unemployment, reducing financial uncertainty, which a lot of governments have been trying to do, but not well enough, especially for self-employed people, such as myself. I think what really, I've read a few really interesting studies. So a lot of the surveys around COVID, and you read sort of news stories saying depression is skyrocketing, anxiety is through the roof, and I think anxiety and distress, that's something that's a real problem with the pandemic. People are worried about contracting it. They're worried about their family members contracting it. They don't know, when they walk outside, they're afraid of, this invisible specter of the future. But with depression, I think a lot of the surveys they're kind of, people take them as a diagnosis of depression, or that people with depressive symptoms have depression, which isn't the same thing. Because if you're suffering from a low mood, for example, that's quite a natural response to a pandemic when you're isolated. It's the line between clinical depression and these sort of like surveys that try and find who's feeling low mood or sadness. I think they should be taken with a pinch of salt. But what worries me is with adolescents and young adults. So I think there needs to be more attention on whether it's it'd be psychotherapy, and especially in schools, and making sure that they have outcomes from all of this. So I think it's seeing it from a societal perspective rather than a treatment perspective. And I hope that if people do if they do need help, then they feel confident that they can, and that there is help available, whether it's psychotherapy. I know people who are now having CBT through a chat box, and some people might think, that's never going to work. Like you need to speak to someone face to face, but actually CBT is more of a process. It's not it's not a psychodynamic, psychoanalytical discussion. It's you can use it on an app. You can use it on your computer. It might not be suited to everyone, and it's not going to work for everyone. But that's a really powerful way of, you know, you can work through your depression, your anxiety, and yeah, I think in terms of treatment, I would go for that, and hopefully people just looking after themselves with exercise and diet, which is obviously quite difficult at the moment. And if everything else fails, you know, antidepressants, they do work for a lot of people. But yeah, I'm terrified of what happens after this pandemic, because yeah, like I said, unemployment and this huge shift in how we live our lives is and yeah, I don't really know how best to approach it. And if I did, I wouldn't be a freelancer working on a book. It would be a bigger role in the world.
Yeah, it's a big question to bite off, and well, we have about just about 3 minutes left, believe it or not, and so I want to turn to one or two questions from our audience. Peter McGennity asks, what do you think is the relationship between depression or the treatment of depression and creativity?
I don't know. I would think that, you know, there's been a lot of discussion and books written on creativity and mental illness and bipolar and manic episodes. I think we kind of idolize that view that, you know, people who are depressed ruminate over things and they can see different angles. And I would say, I think that can go down a dangerous route where it kind of separates people. And, you know, I've heard terms like higher functioning depressive, and I think that's just really horrendous term, that people can be higher functioning, then you can obviously get a lower functioning depressive. It's just, depression isn't it's a horrendous thing to have. And I'm not sure it has any benefits for creativity. I'd love to spend more time working on stuff I do rather than spending months not being able to. But I could be wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, right. And a final question from Chrissy Giles. Chrissy asks, what do you think the increased public discussion of mental illness in recent years, and also as a result of COVID, will mean for research and treatment for depression and anxiety?
I hope it's an opportunity. I hope it, so we're talking more about depression, anxiety, and mental illness. I hope it adds an element of, okay, so people want to talk about this, obviously. Let's try and, I mean, science is ultimately based on funding, right? And if people want to learn about something, if people if they have interest in this field, then they will get more funding for it. So hopefully, you know, by talking about it, we are promoting that science indirectly. But I also think that there's a chance that if we're talking about, you know, mental health as a buzzword, we need to really specify what that means, because it could be that someone's stressed or someone might be, you know, deeply psychotic. So I think we need to really sort of, the role of academics and researchers is to specify that this isn't a buzzword, it's a real diversity of experiences, and we need to be understanding it.
Yeah, back to that same lesson. Okay, well, we are unfortunately out of time. I wish we could go for another 45 minutes at least. I want to remind everyone about that you have the opportunity to purchase Alex's book, A Cure for Darkness, from Nowhere Bookshop. And thank you to Alex for speaking with me today. Thanks to everyone for attending, and forward. Bye-bye.
Thanks.